So it's useful to know, to understand what it means that life is suffering. It's a fundamental ontological truth. It's a fundamental statement about the nature of being. Well, what does human being look like? Well, the Buddhists say life is suffering. That's the first fundamental Buddhist dictum. And I suppose a modern person would tend to think of that as a very pessimistic claim. But I've found when I've shared that information with my students, once they understand what it means, it's actually a relief, because people run around madly suffering away, and all of them inside their little shell think, well, there must be something wrong with me, because here I am suffering, and I mean, that isn't how things are supposed to be. Well, then you might say, who says that's not the way things are supposed to be? The Buddhists say life is suffering. So what that means is, if you're not suffering, that's a good thing, that's lucky, that's fortunate. That's not the way of the world. That may be something to be grateful for, ecstatic about even. And of course, in Christianity, the central symbol of Christianity is a crucifix, which is not a positive symbol in any way. It's a symbol of betrayal by friends, opposition from the state, and mortal vulnerability. It's about as powerful a symbolic representation of the idea that life is suffering as you can put together, which is of course why the power of that symbol extends across several thousand years. Judaism. Well, I don't think it's going to come as a shock to anybody in the audience that Jews are acutely aware of the suffering that's involved in life. So it's useful to know, to understand what it means that life is suffering. It's a fundamental ontological truth. It's a fundamental statement about the nature of being. And there's a reason for that. It's not incomprehensible. It's perfectly comprehensible. We're finite. Right? We have a lifespan that's bounded temporally. You're going to live maybe 100 years, and that'll pretty much be it. And then there's other forms of extreme limitation that are imposed on you that have very little to do with you. They're arbitrary facts of being. You're a certain height, you're a certain weight, you're a certain amount of attractive, you're a certain amount of intelligent, you're a certain amount of athletic, you're a certain amount of mentally ill, you're a certain amount of predisposition to cancer. And it's frequently the case that people like to attribute those vulnerabilities to some flaw in their own nature, but what they are instead are conditions of existence. Human being is predicated on a kind of fundamental limitation in that we are what we are and we're not other things. And so that means inevitably that the awareness of human being comes along with suffering. And life poses the question, how to conduct yourself in the face of suffering. Not only yours, but everyone else's. And it's an inescapable question, except that maybe you're fortunate and you'll have periods of time where something absolutely horrible isn't happening to you. Now, you think about this, because you might think this is pessimistic, but it's not pessimistic. It's actually one of the most freeing things that you can realize. Maybe there's nothing particularly wrong with you at the moment, but there's a high probability that you have a family member that has something seriously wrong with them. And there's a very high probability that if you don't, you will soon. Or maybe you'll have a partner that has something serious wrong with them. And to know this frees you from the false illusion that life can be conducted without suffering. Suffering's an integral part of being. Now, why is that? Well, who knows? It's a metaphysical question. But I have some ideas about that have helped me, and they're things that I've read. I read, for example, an old Jewish commentary about the reason for creation. It's like a Zen koan, this idea. You take a being with the classical attributes of God, omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience. Right? It's a totality. And the question is, well, what does a being with those attributes lack? And the answer is limitation. And then you think, well, what's so important about limitation? Well, if you can be anything or do anything at any time whatsoever, there's no being, because everything is one thing. There's no differentiation between things. So something that's absolute and total has no being. It has to be parceled out into limited being. And you know this because you'll all play games. You play video games, you play games with other people. You may play games you don't even know you're playing. And when you play those games, you put limits on yourself. You play by a set of rules, and the reason you do that is when you limit yourself, arbitrarily in some ways, whole new worlds of possibility emerge. And so there's a powerful metaphysical idea that being is not possible without limitation. So that's an interesting question, that's an interesting idea. So you say, well, what's the price you pay for being? The price you pay for being is limitation, and the price you pay for limitation is suffering. So the price you pay for being is suffering. So what's the problem with that? Well, suffering makes people question the validity of life, right? Everyone does that. If something terrible is happening to you, you're going to wonder why you, that's for sure. Why not you might be a better question, because it's inevitable, but you will wonder that, why you? And you'll wonder, well, is it worth it? Especially if what's happening to you is terrible and prolonged. Is it worth it? Does the cost that you have to pay for being justify itself?